Hi, welcome to part 4 on our subunit related to Greek art. In this video, we're going to be looking at the early classical period, as well as the classical period in architecture as well as sculpture. During this period, Greeks began to establish an idea of beauty that has endured in the Western world today, even to present day. Greek classical art associated itself with three general concepts: humanism, rationalism, and idealism. Please write those down. Greeks believed the words of their philosophers and applied their ideas into their art making. So when you're looking at some of this work of art, I want you to think of man as the measure of all things. So an ideal based on human forms, know thyself, inner significance of forms, and nothing in excess. Reproduce only essential forms. So these were philosophies by classic philosophers, and these are the ideals that they really applied, or artists tried to apply in their art making. In their embrace of humanism, artists began to imagine gods as perfect human beings. They valued human reason and emotion. Many Greek artists and architects were not just practicing artists, but were theoreticians as well. The sculptor Polycletus and the architect I can't say these names, Iktinos, both wrote books on the theory underlying their artistic practice. So not only are we having individual artists, before in with Egyptian art, and before that it was most artists were anonymous. We're also having artists who are writing about their work of art as well. So the classical period is divided into three phases: the early classical, which goes from 480 to 450 BC, high classical 450 to 400 BCE, and late classical 400 to 323 BCE. All right, so this is one of the most important sculptures of all time. This is Greek classical or early classical. It's also known as the severe style. It's called Christos Boy. And so you can see multiple perspectives. So freestanding sculpture was something the Greeks really developed. Um, and so I think when we look at this now, compare it to archaic. Here, I'll get to an image where you don't have to see that anymore there. So how different is this from the archaic period? Take a moment, sort of look at it, and think of some differences. One of the things that hopefully stands out is the stance. Um, this figure exhibits something called a contrapposto stance, Contrapposto. And this really infuses the work with a sort of like lifelikeness and naturalism. Um, and also that archaic smile sort of is not necessary because of sort of the naturalism of the posture of the body. So that's um, fading as well. The figure does have a very serious, pensive face. Um, it's still very much idealized, but more perceptual um, and realistic in its depiction of the human form, especially in relation to of parts to the whole. So it's anatomically correct and proportionally correct. And definitely there's a tension in the depiction of the muscular skeletal structure. So what we see with these pieces is there's a sense of more motion depicted, and this idea of stability in the midst of action. Large freestanding statues in motion are the most important achievement of this sort of early classical style, and it really depends on this discovery of contrapposto and the concept of the body as a single unit. So please know that term, contrapposto. Archaic sculptures, especially on temples, which we saw earlier in part 3, show figures in motion, but they still look very mechanical and inflexible. Let me go back to, yeah, like these guys. And they look like mannequins, where this figure really is starting to look lifelike and human-like. So here's another image. So with the classical period, or the early classical period, we began to observe a shift from the stiff, rigid, and over-stylized archaic chorosphere figures to more relaxed, lifelike figures. And here's sort of a comparison of the earlier archaic Choros figures with the Christos Boy, the early classical figure. The Christos Boy has more soft, rounded contours of a human body, broad facial features, and a calm expression as opposed to that archaic smile. His weight rests on his left leg, and that's the sort of engaged leg, while the right leg is relaxed and bends slightly at the knee. There's a noticeable curve in the spine contours, and mimics the idea of shifting hips, the way we sort of shift our weight when we're standing. And so this statue reflects the beginning of contrapposto. And again, this is the most important Greek art convention. And they'll utilize this and develop it even more in high classical sculptures when we look into later Greek art. And here's another comparison. The idea behind contrapposto is presenting standing figures with opposing alternations of tension and relaxation around a central axis. This concept will dominate classical art, classical Greek art. The slight turn of the head encourages the viewer to follow the gaze of Christos Boy and move around the sculpture and admire it from multiple perspectives. So here with the Choros figures, the earlier archaic Choros figures, it's very symmetrical. And here you start to have that sort of contrapposto where it takes that axis and shifts it slightly, and it's more natural and realistic. These are some very impressive figures. These were actually found at the bottom of the sea, and I guess there was a shipwreck. And one thing I want you to understand was that most Greek sculptures were done in bronze, but so few survive, and they're very rare because during the medieval period, most of these bronze statues were melted down and used for other things. And so the development of the hollow cast bronze in the lost wax process, that's the technique that they use, gave Greek sculptors opportunity to create more complex action poses. These sorts of postures were very difficult to create in marble because the appendages might break off. Bronze figures are more easily balanced because of the metal's tensile, which means greater strength. And so because of that, artists were allowed to experiment with more complicated gestures. And the use of bronze made this technically possible. So Warrior from the Sea of Rice, Italy. It's a bronze statue that stands about over 6 feet high. And the Rice Warrior, like most classical Greek statues, was sculpted in bronze. Again, most classical bronzes have not survived. Much of the classical Greek sculpture today that we see and study are Roman marble copies because, again, it was melted down. So it's rare to see one of these. And the only reason why this survived was because it was lost in a shipwreck and buried, at sea for so long. In 1972, a pair of large-than-life bronze figure warriors from the seabed off the coast of Rice, Italy, known as the Rice Arios, was discovered. These figures reveal a balance of idealized suppleness of the skin and almost too perfect anatomy. These statues demonstrate early classical standards that encourage the artist to reproduce details from observation of nature. So when we look closely, we'll see swelling veins and definitely this sort of hyper realistic muscular structure. Again, we can see the idea of contrapposto is further developed in these figures than the Christos Boy, with more pronounced counterbalances between tension and shifting weight. Oops. The figure demonstrates the possibility of movement in life. This intense study of the human figure to an idealism that exaggerates nature will continue in the high classical period. All right, so the high classical period goes from 450 to 400 BCE, and it really focused on representing perfect proportions of the human form. It lasted only half a century. The use of the word high reflects a value judgment of art historians who considered this period a pinnacle of artist refinement and work that set a standard of unsurpassed excellence. It's also referred to as sort of the golden age in classical art or Greek art. Sparta, which was another city-state in Athens, had united to drive out Persia, but now turned on each other in a series of conflicts known as the Peloponnesian War. Athens became even more wealthy by this time. The Athenian leader Pericles dominated political culture. He was a great supporter of the arts and used Athenian wealth to support and adorn the city by encouraging artists to promote public images of peace, prosperity, and power. So again, this is probably one of the most important sculptures of all time. We looked at this in class. I made you do a power sketch. And so this is Polyclitus, Doryphorus. And Doryphorus translates into Spearbearer, and we're looking at a Roman marble copy that was found in Pompeii. But the bronze original probably dates from 450 to 440 BCE. So again, the popularity of ancient Greek art for the Romans. Greek art became the rage when Roman generals began conquering Greek cities, beginning in 211 BCE, and returned triumphantly to Rome, not with the usual booty of gold and silver coins, but with works of art. This work so impressed the Roman elite that studios were set up to meet the growing demand for copies destined for villas of wealthy Romans. So the Romans really loved Greek statue art, high classical art, and so this was copied multiple times. The Doryphorus was one of the most sought after and most copied Greek sculptures. So again, getting back to this idea of bronze versus marble. For the most part, the Greeks created their freestanding sculpture in bronze. Again, because bronze is valuable and can be melted down and reused, sculptures were often recast into weapons. This is why so few ancient Greek bronze originals survive, and why we often have to look at an ancient Roman copy in marble of varying quality to try to understand what the Greeks achieved. One of the best examples of sculpture from this period and best known is Polyclitus, who was also an accomplished theorist of this period. He promoted the quest of ideal ways of representing the human body. He studied actual human beings and selected attributes he considered most desirable. One of the best marble replicas stood in a gymnasium at Pompeii, where it stood as an example of for Roman athletes. The Spearbearer was the embodiment of Polyclitus's vision of the ideal statue of a male nude athlete or warrior. He made it as a demonstration piece to accompany a treatise he wrote concerning the subject, and it was entitled The Canon. The Spearbearer is an evolution of archaic chorus figures to the Christos Boy. Contrapposto is more pronounced than ever before in this particular standing figure. The artist was not just content with rendering a standing figure naturally. His aim was to impose order and balance on human movement to make it beautiful and perfect. He achieved this through a system of cross-balance relationships between weight-bearing and relaxed legs and arms around a central axis. And again, this is also called symmetria. So the Greeks really loved incorporating this convention into their work. Note how the straight arm echoes the rigid supported leg, providing an anchor for the left side dynamically flexed limbs. If we read the figure diagonally, we see an opposition of tense and relaxed limbs. The right and left legs are relaxed, and the tense supporting leg opposes the flexed arm, which would have held the spear. The head twists to the right, while the hips twist slightly to the left, and although it appears as if the figure stepped forward, he does not move. The combination of dynamic asymmetrical balance, motion while at rest, and the resulting harmony of opposites are the essence of Polykleitos' style and high classical sculpture. And so here it also signifies a shift of a god-like humans that Greeks are moving towards. So there really are, the gods look like humans. And so they're really embracing that idea. So think about, in terms of conventions related to high classical sculpture, the emphasis on the contrapposto stance, the calm facial expression, obviously this attention to the nude male form, and it's realistic yet idealized. Okay, so this isn't of a specific person, but the idea is that Polykleitos took sort of the best attributes of the male form and sort of combined them into this canon that he created. Let's see. Let me go back, sorry. So let's get back to this idea of the canon. The idea of a canon is a rule for a standard of beauty developed for artists to follow. Was not new to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Egyptians also developed a canon centuries later. During the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci investigated the ideal proportions of the human body with his Vitruvius Man. Polykleitos' idea of relating beauty to ratio was later summarized by Galen, who wrote in the 2nd century. Beauty consists in the proportions, not of the elements, but of the parts, that is to say, of finger to finger, and of all the fingers to the palm and the wrist, and of these to the forearm, and of the forearm to the upper arm, and of all the other parts to each other. Okay, so this idea of all the parts as a whole was a really important concept with this idea of the canon related to the Greek classical male form. Again, you can get a better sense. Again, these sculptures were designed from, to be pleasing from multiple perspectives. All right, so now we're going to get into some more architecture. What you're looking at is an aerial view of the Acropolis in Greece. So Athens is the capital of modern Greece, and it's located on the Saronic Gulf, just inland from the port of Pyrrhus. In the second half of the 5th century BCE, Athens was the site of a full flowering of the classical style in the arts. This section considers that culmination as it was embodied in the building of the Acropolis. Particularly the Parthenon. The Acropolis, from the Greek akros, meaning high or upper, and polis, meaning city, is a fortified rock supporting several temples, precincts, and other buildings. Its steep walls meant that it could not be scaled by invaders. And so the Acropolis provided sanctuary for citizens in times of siege. The classical period in Athens is also called the Age of Pericles after the Greek general and statesman. He lived from 500 to 429 BCE, and he initiated the architectural projects from the Acropolis. He planned a vast rebuilding campaign to celebrate Athenian art and civilization after the devastation of the Persian Wars. The Propylae and the Parthenon were completed during his lifetime, so these were structures that are located within the Acropolis. We're going to be looking at the Parthenon in great detail. But the work on the Temple of Athena and the Erechtheum were not begun until after his death, so these are some other architectural sites that are important. Let's see. So this is a model of the Acropolis in Athens and how it would have looked. And one of the things that we want to think about with Greek and Athens is this idea of democracy. By around 500 BCE, ruled by the people or democracy, this idea had emerged in the city of Athens. Following the defeat of a Persian invader in 480 to 479 BCE, mainland Greece and Athens in particular entered into a golden age. In drama and philosophy, literature, art, and architecture, Athens was second to none. The city's empire stretched from the western Mediterranean to the Black Sea, creating enormous wealth. This paid for one of the biggest public building projects ever seen in Greece, which included the Parthenon. The temple known as the Parthenon was built on the Acropolis of Athens between 447 and 438 BCE. It was part of a vast building program masterminded by Athenian statesman Pericles. Inside the temple stood a colossal statue representing Athena, who was the patron goddess of the city. The statue, which no longer exists, was made of gold and ivory and was the work of the celebrated sculptor Phidias. And so here is a kind of a floor plan of the Acropolis, and you are expected to know this. This is actually one of the images that they might pop up when you're taking the major AP exam. And so this really is a sort of a good way to look at city planning and really how they laid out these structures. And again, when we look at this floor plan, and we might compare it with some other floor plans, we see that this really is more about urban architecture and public architecture. All right, I'm trying to decide if I should, yeah, I'm going to stop here because the Parthenon's pretty extensive. So in our next segment, we are going to be looking at the Parthenon. And so stay tuned for part 4. Wait, is this? Yeah, part 4. Okay.